Okay, we're going to short stories now. Next up, a couple of short stories addressing the topic of accessing diverse markets. First up, we have Amy Fridlund on how to build brand value through gender inclusivity and to discover steps brands can take to better address customer gender needs. Amy Fritz is passionate about asking scary questions. Every day she's driven to find new ways to understand the human condition through the intersection of disciplines, biology and art, culture and economics. A former quantitative researcher underpinned by her background in anthropology and design, Fritz has a special interest in championing gender equality causes in businesses. Please welcome Amy to the stage.
Today, another way of saying building brand value through gender inclusivity, I mean, that's a whole big mouthful, isn't it? What I wanted to talk to you about today is why it's so important that we change the ratio. It's about changing the world we live in. And it's about changing the products that we have available to us and the services that we have available to us as women and men and people of color and every type, shape, and form. So when I was 17, I found that I felt that the world was not made for me. And back then in 1989, somewhere around there, I found myself in an airport in New Hampshire in the US, my country of origin, and I was sitting waiting for a flight, and I had a pillow with me, a blanket, and a backpack, a bunch of stuff, and finally my flight got called, and I went up to the sliding glass doors, and the gentleman said to me, you going for a sleepover, honey? And that ticked me off, because not only was I not going for a sleepover, but I was piloting the plane. And I said so. That was my first solo flight in a little Cessna 172. And but what ticked me off more was the fact that 172, I had to bring that pillow and that blanket and all that stuff to shove behind me, because the foot pedals wouldn't crank far enough forward to accommodate me. Now, I'm a researcher and an anthropologist, and if there's one thing I know, it's statistics. And I am world average height, and I am world average weight. And I was back then as well. I've been exactly the same size since then. And what ticked me off is that what that said to me is the world is not made for you. This is not for you. Luckily, my dad disagreed and said, bugger them. And I solo flighted, and that led to me getting my little private pilot's license. But what that leads to is this really important topic for me, and it's always been a bit of a cause, I think, since then, about the products and services we have available to us as women. And I'm starting with the topic of gender, but obviously I think this is a far bigger issue, and I will allude to that at the end. So the first question, and by the way, I'm from an organization called Kantar, which is a data insights and consultancy. We're part of WPP. So we talk to businesses and help them understand their consumers and understand data and what's going on in the world today. And so this is something I've been researching for quite a few years now. And the interesting thing is that when I first started digging around, there wasn't very much data. In fact, there was no data. I almost found zero data. And to this day, it's still pretty hard to find data about gender differences. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But it's a really sensitive issue, not only in HR rooms, but also in boardrooms where you talk about products and services. Most of the companies that I've talked to, people just clam up about this issue, talking about, well, what are gender differences? Everybody just starts looking at each other across the room, the pink elephant in the corner of the room. And what I've really tried to encourage people is to start talking about this, not just as an inclusivity HR function within organizations as far as employees, but also what are you doing for your consumers? Half of them are women. So the first question I say, does your brand have gender risks or gender opportunities? And people go, what? What does that even mean? So I'm going to make a case today for not the fact that we know that gender inclusivity in an employee sense leads to a better bottom line, but the fact that it also is leading to brands hemorrhaging profitability in a different way by not meeting consumer needs better. So it's a sensitive issue. It's also, it's not just an issue for women. It's an issue for men, and that's some of the evidence that we've been building at Kantar has started to find that it's not just about women. Men have just as many gripes about the advertising that exists out there. They have just as many gripes. I mean, we did some research I can share with you with Subway. And one of the funny things was, it was the guys who said, would it kill you to put a nice picture on the wall in the shop? I sit out in my truck every day to eat because it's a prettier, landscape than in here. So, a lot of the things that I want to stress with you today are about doing the research and realizing that these things that we think might be true about gender maybe aren't, and you got to do the hard yards. So it's not about internal diversity that I'm talking about. It's a sensitive issue. I also want to point out that it's really hard for people to talk about because we're so used to living in this world. We're so used to those foot pedals, which, by the way, for an airplane, that's how you turn the plane. You gotta have those. It's also how you brake. But these are things that we've been living with year after year after year. This is the world we've grown up in. And, so we're used to all these things that we don't realize are perhaps a gender issue. And also the other thing is that there are lots of little things that add up to something bigger. They add up to frustration. They add up to women being more likely to incur a lethal injury in a car. So some of these things might seem little, but the repercussions are quite big. And I don't know, has anybody read the book that came out in March, Invisible Women? It's by a journalist in the US named Perez, and she highlights how the products and services nowadays still aren't made for women, and not adequately so, and that it can lead to horrible outcomes like fatalities, increased fatalities. And I'm sure you've heard some of the news about the medical implications of medications not being tested on women. So. But most of our clients, let's say, aren't dealing with such grave issues. But the fact of the matter is that there's money being left on the table as a result of it. So I think you might be quite familiar with some of the statistics around how women and men feel about advertising. This is how marketers feel about advertising. Yeah, we're doing a good job. Some average 83%, I think, say, we're not stereotyping, we're not creating gender imbalanced content, we're doing a good job, aren't we? Well, unfortunately, we also know that 75% of men and women think that the way they're reflected in media really doesn't depict them the way they feel they ought to be depicted. So, there's a huge gap there, and this is just advertising, okay? If we look at brands from a higher up perspective, we have a brand equity valuation syndicated study that we do, which is called Brand Z, and those are some of the studies on there. And Brand Z brands are more likely to grow. They have better valuation, and they're more likely to recover in economic downturns. They outpace the S&P index and other indices. They are brands that are strong and more likely to grow based on being meaningfully different to people. And when we looked at these brands and analyzed them by gender, and this has been a thing for us to start looking at our own data and start revisiting a topic that we thought we had sort of mastered back in the 1970s, and we realized that, okay, there's only 1.24% difference in males and females' predisposition to brands. Well, being researchers, we dug a little further, and this is what we found. Now, this is a natural bell curve, but what it is showing you the diversity of brands, different types of brands. Most brands, yes, are neutral, but there's a whole host of brands that skew kind of male and a whole host of brands that skew kind of female. So what it says to us is that the way brands are perceived by and bought or how consumers are interested in brands varies. So some are more male-oriented and some are more female-oriented. This is, by the way, Brand Z is we interview some 650,000 consumers around the world, and we look at some 23,000 brands. There isn't a larger study, so this is robust data. So when you think about a brand, though, you might say, well, it makes sense for some brands to be skewed. Wild turkey, it's a blokey kind of thing. Of course it's going to be masculine. Yep. The Body Shop makes sense. It's more feminine sort of skincare and makeup and that sort of thing. It's understandable that it would be skewed. But there are brands out there that are skewed without trying to be. And a great example was Nike back about 10 years ago. Only a quarter of their sales were to women. And Under Armour, quite differently, was founded quite a bit later, but they got that right from the start. And that's something that Nike has really worked on over the past 10 years to correct, and they largely have. So what we're talking about is sort of an unintentional gender skew. And while it makes sense for some brands, most brands, it doesn't. Remember all those little tensions I was talking about? Those are the things that are perhaps adding up to that skew that we're seeing. Now, you might say, well, so what? So it's a little bit skewed. Well, unfortunately, it's $13 billion per year in Australia being left on the table as a result of a gender skew. That 1.24 adds up real quick. Okay? And this is brands unintentionally not realizing that they're slightly skewed male. And what we found actually in some industries is that the brands were actually getting more male skewed. For example, financial industries in Australia are getting more male skewed. But what it's telling us is that brands could be doing better to be meeting the needs of both men and women in Australia, and that they're leaving money on the table by not doing so. And so I might ask you now, I've sort of alluded to it, but can anybody name a gender difference? That's probably a good thing, because I've done a lot of research and read a lot of the neuroscience, I've read a lot of the social science, and nothing points to any inherent gender differences. So when we look at the brain, we can see structural differences, possibly up to 11% structural and connectivity differences. Do we know what this means? No. We have no idea what this means as far as an implication on behavior, attitudes, preferences, you name it. Now, is there a cultural layer on top of that that possibly leads to gender differences? Yes, I think we definitely can say that. But we have to ask ourselves, when we don't find any inherent differences, does that mean we need to be treating men and women the same? Or does it mean that, well, maybe we just don't know enough yet? And I'm open to that question. I don't feel I've gotten to the bottom of it, despite looking at this for years. But I think it's something we all have to start examining and start researching as organizations. Because the difference between a stereotype and a segment is data. Okay? And so we need to examine those things that we maybe have taken for granted in our organizations, who we target, how we speak to them, the type of proposition we give them, but also the things we're creating in the first place, the products and services that we deem useful. And I think those may differ by gender. I don't know. I think it's going to really differ depending on your industry. So one thing, I used to work for an industrial design firm as a design anthropologist. And one principle that I learned there that I really loved was called designing to the edges. And designing to the edges is about looking at the furthest extremes of users. I think some of you who have design thinking background in your creative industries may have heard this term. And it's about being inclusive in your design as opposed to designing for the lowest common denominator. And it's something I've really, I've carried through my career and really believe can push design and push product development to be as good as it can be. And a company that I really love in the way that they design inclusively is IKEA. Maybe I'm just a bit biased because I'm Swedish descent, but it does herald that sort of classic Scandinavian egalitarianism in everything from the fact that they produce a catalog so that as if you're, and I like to talk about these as more feminine and masculine, as some people have talked about earlier, because I don't think we know necessarily whether it's one or the other, and I certainly know that there are some cases where I'm very masculine in the way I approach things, and other times I'm very feminine in the way I approach things. But IKEA here, they allow for planning, and some evidence suggests that women prefer to pre-plan a little bit more. There's an opportunity to have a refuel break. Some people suggest that men really like that. You know, it makes the shopping experience less dire. You have the opportunity for wandering through and looking aesthetically at everything that there is on offer and seeing how it looks in situ, as well as going straight to pick and pack and choosing what you want and getting on with it. At the end of the day, I think when we start to realize that we don't quite understand gender, we start to realize that maybe we don't understand consumers as well as we think we do. And that maybe we need to start re-examining all these things that we assumed from the beginning, like ageism. Is it really true that, you know, people of a certain age are a certain way? Funny enough, statistically, guess what one of those determines is most correlated between two individuals? Shows individuals who are most, sorry, I'm not saying that word. You have two people. Which one of those things will determine their likeness? Any guess? It's not gender, obviously. It's actually socioeconomic class. So if you have a doctor, female doctor from Japan, is more probably going to be alike to a male doctor here in Australia. That's some of the things that we've started to realize. So just some interesting stuff. I think the discussion of gender leading to this discussion of intersectionality and really beginning to understand ourselves in different ways as humans and how we relate to the world and potentially products. We might see some airplanes that have pedal cranks that move a little bit further back, soccer boots that I fit in this country, and a host of other things. Thank you.